I will have to start again. I'm a coach first, a scientist second. Some would say a pretty ordinary scientist, I guess. So today's supposed to be fun. Sit back, relax, enjoy yourself. I would like it to be as much about a discussion as well. I don't profess to know everything about strength and conditioning and high performance athletes. No one does. I'm often amused by my PhD students when they first start with me and they say, but Dr. Newton, there's nothing else to learn. Everything's been answered. There's no more questions. The longer I spend in this area, the less I know. There is always myriad more to learn, and I hark to the Dean's comments regarding investment in research into all forms of endeavour, but I believe that human performance is one of the highest. The human species is the dominant species on the planet by a very long way. We take over everything and control everything. We are far superior than all other species. To come to understand the human function in terms of its physiology and its biomechanics and its psychology is truly the ultimate in terms of human learning and understanding. This is a very valuable area. What we learn from studying the most supreme physical specimens of our species, the elite athlete, is a level of learning which is critically important to us and to humanity. So I would encourage your government and all governments to invest in this very important area of research. I wish to thank, in particular, Professor Pedro Milhomes. Sorry for the pronunciation, but I know it means 1,000 men. And I think that is a really, really good name. My name is Newton, also a good name, very bright man. I wish that I had 1/10 of his intellect, but it is I thank you for the invitation to speak, and again, an extreme honour for me to actually speak at the University of Lisbon, a university which I've learned this morning is actually older than the actual Western civilization in my country. So that is amazing for me. So, let's get started. Again, if you feel you wish to ask a question, please feel free. Stick your hand up and I will do my best to reply. We're going to cover a series of topics over the day. I will try to go slowly. I get excited and I go faster and faster. So I apologise to my translator. Please just let me know if I am going too quickly. But I do get very excited about this topic. We're going to start off with something a little bit theoretical. I apologise, it's up front, but you're nice and awake and bright this morning. So we will go through that first. And that is some of the basic theoretical underpinnings of human performance, in particular with regard to strength and power. We will then look at strength and power more generally and practical applications of that, and then move on to what has been termed performance diagnosis. So this is the assessment of the athlete, all aspects of the athlete's performance. We will focus on strength and power and how that can be used to inform training program design, but also the overall management of the athlete in terms of rest and recovery. I'm hoping to have a practical session. Now, it will be a little bit constrained here. We're going to have to simulate on the computer some aspects of that, but we'll do our best on that. I'd like to spend some time talking about muscle hypertrophy. This is a major challenge for many of our athletes and coaches, in particular in competition, how to maintain muscle mass. Some hot topics that we will also cover, things which I think have considerable potential, which are starting to develop new ideas and new techniques, new systems of training, which have considerable potential to improve performance and also the safety of our athlete management. want to spend a little bit of time talking about facts, fads or fashions, and also fallacies or false misunderstandings as well. Because our area of endeavour, because it involves such large numbers of people, both athletes and the general public, because it can involve quite large amounts of money. When we look at professional sport, when we look at the actual payment for success in competition is quite large. Not so large for the coaches, unfortunately. Definitely not large for the scientists, Pedro. But because of that, there is a lot of witchcraft and snake oil salesmen. I hope you can translate that one. It's okay. In our field, selling new ideas, new systems, new potions, new medicines, new ideas, often without any scientific basis. And so we'll spend some time having a look at that and trying to understand their true empirical nature. In other words, is there any underlying research evidence to support them? So we'll get going to begin with the first topic, which I apologise is a little bit dry, but we'll get it done first thing while we're all still a little bit fresh. But I just want to cover some of the theoretical underpinnings of my talks for the rest of the day, so we're all on the same playing field in terms of our understanding of where I'm heading with this discussion. I'm going to spend most of the day talking about size, in other words, muscle size, strength, speed, and power. Most sports, certainly any field-based sports, any of your throwing sports, swimming, certainly weightlifting, one of the main requirements for success in that sport from a purely mechanical point of view. I won't be talking today about psychology, I won't be talking about tactics, I won't be talking about skill. I'll be talking about how do you build the race car, how do you build the machine. So today, we'll be looking at those very, very explosive actions. So the spike in volleyball, the jump and head in soccer, football. We'll be talking about the takeoff in high jump or pole vault. Those very, very explosive activities. And also, in terms of sprint acceleration, change of direction, what you typically see in a field sport such as field hockey or football, those very rapid accelerations over short duration, rapid change of direction. Those sort of activities require the underlying machine to have very high strength and to have very high power. In other words, to be able to apply that strength, that force at high speed, to be able to increase that force very rapidly, or what has been termed rate of force development. So this conceptualises what we'll be talking about today. How do we make our athletes bigger, stronger, faster, and more powerful? So, why is power so important? This is a paper here from 2010 by Borden and others, and what they examined was the season best performance here as a percentage of the world record, and they compared it to the athlete's strength in bench press and the half squat, half back squat. Now, what we see, these are for throwers, okay? So these are discus, hammer, and shot. The relationship between the athlete's performance and their strength is remarkable. 0.71. that means that at least 50% of the athlete's season's best throw in discus shot, javelin, hammer, whatever, is determined by how much they can bench press. Similarly, for the half squat, it's 0.54 is the correlation, which equates to around 25 to 30% of their actual throw performance is determined by how much they can squat. So in terms of throwing, we know, and you all know as well, the athlete has to be very strong to be successful. This is data from our laboratory. This is Prue Cormie, one of my doctoral students, is now a senior research fellow in our laboratory. And we published a series of papers in 2010. They were published in the journal Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. Much of the data that I'll be presenting over the course of the day is from these series of studies. So if you'd like to read in more depth, I recommend these papers. And if you email me, I can send you copies of these particular papers. What we saw here in recreationally trained athletes is the relationship between their jump squat. So not strength, but actually their maximum power. So in a jump squat, weight on the shoulders, they're jumping into the air, how much power they can actually exert on the ground to accelerate their body upwards. And it's expressed relative to body weight, so watts per kg. Now this is a really common physical quantity, a quantity of physics that we apply to a lot of systems, a lot of machines to express their performance. One of the most important physical performance measures that we report for a car, for example, is its power to weight ratio, because that determines purely how fast it will accelerate. So quite often we will express the power of the athlete relative to their body weight. In this case, it's watts of power per kilogram of body weight. What we see here in 40-metre sprint time, we see a very strong relationship, 0.77. It's negative because, of course, the more powerful the athlete, the faster their sprint time. 0.77 relationship. So once again, around 50% of their performance in a 40-metre sprint can be related to their power output when they jump, when they do a vertical jump. Some further data here. This is delving down into the 10-metre sprint time. Here we see a weaker relationship here, but still significant. And then it reduces somewhat again when we look at 5-metre sprint time here related to power. So whether it be 5, 10 or 40-metre sprint time, it is dictated to a large extent by the athlete's capacity for power output when they perform a vertical jump. So how do we develop power in our athletes? What's the most effective and efficient way to achieve this? What movements should we use? What loads should we use in terms of resistance to their movement? Repetition and sets configurations. When should we perform power training, particularly within a periodised plan? How do you quantify and track power? And in particular, we'll be looking a lot today at the role of strength in the development of power. I'm not sure the situation currently in Portugal, but in Australia and the United States and many other countries of Europe, there has been a reduced emphasis on strength in the athlete. And people are looking at other ways to increase the athlete performance. They are looking at other ways to increase power. What we'll find today is that the power is built on a foundation of strength. The athlete has to be strong first. An athlete can be strong and powerful but they cannot be powerful if they are not strong. All of the research evidence shows this clearly, and we'll present that research evidence to you today. Okay, how are we going for speed? Some more data from our laboratory. You're going to see lots of data today. Here we have the relationship, revisiting it here, between maximal strength and maximal power. Maximal strength measured in a back squat. In this particular case, it was to a 90-degree knee angle. And we see back squat expressed in body weights. So, for example, this is value 2 here. That's where the athlete is performing the back squat with 2 times their body weight on their shoulders. And then we have the relationship to power output during a jump squat. This is a jump squat with no weight. So this is a jump squat performed simply with body weight. Once again, in this particular data from our laboratory, we see a very strong correlation, 0.64. On a reasonable number of athletes, 85 here, you can see the relationship. So, maximal strength and maximal power are highly related. Now, it's not just our data. If we look at a number of other studies here, we see similar relationships in different types of athletes, but very close in terms of the correlation between maximal strength and maximal power. It's interesting because a lot of coaches will say, I work with tennis. The tennis racket only weighs a couple of 100 grams. How can strength be important? Interesting data. This is from Mike Stone, paper published back in 2003. And what he looked at was the relationship between strength and jump power at different loads. So 10%, etc., through to 90% of their 1RM. So they start out jumping with practically body weight and then increasing amounts of weight on the shoulders. And what we see is that the correlation between the two does not really change. So even when performing explosive movements with light weights, there is still the same relationship between the athlete's strength and their power output. Now, this has been demonstrated very, very well, particularly by researchers such as Goldhofer from his group. Dietmar Smit-Bleicher has demonstrated this as well. That strength will dictate the performance in very explosive movements, even with very light loads. Because we'll look into it in more detail, but when the muscle contracts, when you actually activate the muscle to hit the tennis ball, the system responds. It doesn't differentiate that you're actually trying to hit something or move something which is light. It doesn't differentiate that. All it does is try to accelerate as rapidly as possible. It tries to move as quickly as possible. And that's why strength still underpins performance, even in movements which have very little resistance to them. I work a lot with swimming. I've been working with swimming since, probably telling my age, but the late 70s. And this has been a point of contention that coaches bring to me. But the hand through the water only pushes about 5 kilograms of force. Well, kilograms is not a force, but it actually is the equivalent of about 5 kilograms. So why would my athletes be doing lat pull downs or tricep extensions with tens or even hundreds of kilograms? For the same reason. When you activate the muscle, it tries to move as quickly as possible. And the forces that it generates are required to accelerate the limb. And there is a relationship. Clearly, the shorter the event in swimming, the stronger the relationship. But several quality research studies have demonstrated that the stronger the athlete in sprint swimming, the faster their personal best time. So even in a sport such as swimming, where you think the resistance they're just pulling through the water, strength still underpins a lot of their performance. This is some data, once again, from our laboratory here. This is looking at different types of athletes. These are weak recreational athletes. Here, their back squat strength is only about 1.2 to 1.3 body weight. So this is a pretty weak individuals here. You can see the numbers of athletes. And we see that their relationship here between power in the jump squat and the load in the 1RM here, you can see that relationship there. Quite a linear relationship. But as we get stronger, we see that all points, regardless of the load that they're jumping with, all of the points on the curves rise. So if we have a look, these are cross-sectional studies. If we have a look here, these are strong recreational athletes where they have 2 body weights of strength. We see that even at light loads of 0%, we still have the same advantage in terms of power output. Again, this is cross-sectional data indicating that strength underpins performance whether the load that you are working against is high or whether it is low. So why? Why does this occur? You may be familiar with these curves from the 1930s, Fenn and also Hill. Between 1930 and 1938, there was huge research efforts around understanding the physiology of muscle contraction. And what these researchers did was actually map the relationship between the force that's being applied or the resistance that you have to work against and the resulting velocity of movement and the power output produced. And what we see, of course, and most of you will be familiar with these classic curves, is that if we look at the velocity of movement here being 1, this is a proportion of maximum shortening velocity, we see that the force that has to be produced up to isometric maximum here, the force that has to be produced, or the load that you have to work against, we see this relationship here that the velocity must decrease. In other words, the heavier the weight you have to move, the slower you can move it. Looking at it another way, the faster you have to move, the less force the muscle can generate. Now, the combination of these relationships here, because power is equal to force multiplied by velocity, it results in this power curve that we see here, where the peak in power output is produced at approximately 1/3, about 30% of the maximum force capacity or 30% of the maximum shortening velocity of the muscle. Now, this relationship holds consistent whether we are looking at a single muscle fibre, whether we are looking at a whole muscle in isolation. So you get a cat or a frog or a dog, take a muscle out, put it in a test tube, in a tissue bath, electrically stimulate it with different loads on it. This is the relationship you get. If you take a human, a classic study by a Japanese group, Kaneko and others, 1983, they had humans performing a very simple movement of holding weighted balls in their hand, like weighted shot. And they simply performed a throw movement over their shoulder, like that. This is a classic study. And they tested the athletes at 0%, so unweighted, and then they tested 30, 60, 90, and 100% or an isometric contraction. They got the same relationship. Even in multi-joint movements, such as a bench throw, so the athlete's lying on their back and they're throwing bars into the air of different weights. It's multi-joint, it's quite complex movement, you get the same relationship. The peak in power is produced at 30% of the maximum force or 30% of the maximum shortening velocity. This is a very basic principle of muscle physiology. So why is it important? Well, it's important because of the relationship to the actual contractile elements within the muscle. So you are aware that muscle is made up of these contractile elements here, or what are called sarcomeres. The velocity of shortening is determined by the number of sarcomeres in series. So the longer the muscle, the longer the fascicle within the muscle, then the faster it can shorten and the longer range over which it can shorten. That's why when we do eccentric exercise and when we stretch, we actually increase the length of the muscle fascicles, we increase the length of the muscle overall. That improves its range of motion, but it also increases the velocity with which the muscle can shorten. We can also increase the number of sarcomeres in parallel. So the muscle actually grows larger in cross-section. That produces an increase in the maximum force capacity. Because as an overall best rule, if you like, the larger the cross-sectional area of the muscle, the greater the force it can produce. And that is why a lot of us as strength and conditioning specialists or fitness coaches focus on increasing or maintaining muscle cross-sectional area in our athletes, because it dictates the amount of force the muscle can produce. So, two very important concepts which we're going to come back to when we look at training program design. So what happens then if we increase the strength of this system? So all we're doing is a 40% increase out to here. So 1.0 out to 1.4, 40% increase. Now, as you all know, over a period of time for an athlete, particularly one that does not have a very large strength training background, 40% increase in back squat is quite doable. It's quite achievable in both men and women. But what happens is we not only shift this point here, but it shifts the entire curve. We see here, even if we don't change any aspects of the shortening velocity of the muscle, we see that at any given force level, the muscle can contract more quickly, simply by increasing force maximum. But we see an even more dramatic shift in the power curve here, where we see much higher power outputs at any given resistance that the athlete is performing against. And in particular, the maximum power output shifts upwards and it shifts to the right. So that's what happens when we increase strength. It's at a simplistic level, it is why making the athlete stronger in the majority of studies has also made them more powerful, more explosive and faster, if we don't mess this up. Vmax, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so a whole lot of components actually contribute to these changes. It's not only the changes in the actual size of the muscle that we produce here, but also neural activation. The human system, as you can appreciate, because you work with them on a day-to-day basis, is extremely complex. It makes a brand new AMG Mercedes. Does that translate okay? AMG Mercedes? Or maybe a better car. What's a great supercar? A Pagano. Is Pagano Portuguese? No, Italian. Ferrari. Everyone knows Ferrari, yeah? Okay. The human body makes the Ferrari, the latest model Ferrari, look about as complex as a skateboard. We have more computers, we have more wiring, we have more systems that have to interact than a Ferrari. So it is an extremely complex system that we're working with. It also has intelligence, unlike a Ferrari, and it also adapts and changes and it can learn, unlike a Ferrari. So we're going to look at some of these systems. We can also look at the fibre composition because we can change that markedly. Architectural characteristics we'll examine today. particularly with regard to muscle length, cross-sectional area and pronation angle. We'll look at other aspects around intermuscular coordination and intramuscular coordination, and also the anatomical joint configuration dictates force output and also speed of movement, but we're born with that and we can't alter that. So I hope that this demonstrates that there is a very robust relationship between strength and power in the athlete. Okay, complex slide, let's take our time and we'll talk through it. Okay, the first aspect, I guess, that I'd like to cover is the effect of fibre type here. So as you all know, we have different characteristics of the muscle fibres that make up the muscles of our body. Our different muscles in our body have different compositions. To a reasonable extent, our muscle fibre composition is dictated by our genetics. But now we know that that can be changed quite markedly. We can produce considerable shifts in muscle fibre expression. It's not fixed, within a degree. And the different fibre types that we have, and there's different ways in which they're expressed depending on how they're actually histologically described. But if we have a look here, one of the most basic systems is type 1, 2A and 2X. What we see is that different fibre types within the muscle have different power capabilities. In fact, 2X is much higher than 2A, which is higher than type 1. So remember from your physiology that type 1 is your more endurance, your more aerobic type fibre. It is better, it has higher mitochondrial content, it is better able to utilise oxygen and fuel to develop continuous low intensity energy production. Whereas your type 2 are more fatigable but can produce energy output and work and power much faster. So the differences in these fibres in terms of power output is primarily due to the enzyme that actually causes muscle contraction, ATPase, here. But what it results in is a much higher maximum velocity of shortening for your type 2 fibres. The contraction time and twitch duration are much faster, and also the cross-bridge cycle rate is much higher. In other words, the ability of type 2 fibres to actually cycle through and contract is much better than it is for type 1 fibres. So this is some data. It's getting old now, 1986. But here is some data from Faulkner, some classic studies here comparing fast fibres and slow fibres. We see this is the typical force velocity curve for slow twitch fibres here, and then for fast fibres we see that they can contract much more quickly at a given force level. If we have a look at the power output as well, we see power output here for slow twitch fibres, and then we see a roughly 4 times the power output capability of fast twitch fibres. So fast twitch fibres not only have higher force capability or strength, roughly 2 to 3 times slow fibres, but they have 4 to 5 times the power output. So naturally that's why some athletes are much better at explosive, powerful type activities rather than endurance type activities. This is some more data just exemplifying that further from Bottinelli's group. And we see here, this is the difference in maximum power output here for type 1 fibres through to the different fibre types here, right up to your very fast glycolytic fibres here, 2B fibres. So you can see the changes there. And the same, if we have a look at the velocity and power output here, type 2B, far superior in terms of power output to the other fibre types, in particularly compared to type 1. So in terms of your athletes, choose your athletes well. Choose your athletes that have the right parents is probably the take-home message. But you have what you have. We have to work with the athlete that we have. We can't change their genetics. We can change the expression or the epigenetics quite markedly in the athlete within limits. Cross-sectional area, muscle size really dictates force output. if you have a look here, the greater the cross-sectional area, the greater the maximum force capacity of the muscle, the greater the power output that it can produce. However, not all the variation in whole muscle force can purely be explained by cross-sectional area here. Fibre type does dictate to a large extent the force output, but we see that still cross-sectional area, regardless of the fibre type, 1, 2A or 2X here, we see there's still a very linear relationship between cross-sectional area and the peak force output. So cross-sectional area determines force output as well. Architecture within the muscle. Most of the muscles in the body are what are called pennate muscles. In other words, their fibres or fascicles come in at an angle here to the actual tendon or aponeurosis that they attach to here. Now this has a lot of advantage. You can pack more muscle into a particular area, so you can generate a lot more force by these muscles than a non-pennated muscle such as the biceps. There's important interactions here, and they include the effect of the length of the fascicles, so the distance from here to here, this length, is a big determinant of the maximum shortening velocity of the particular muscle. So if you have a muscle that only has 6 sarcomeres, this is a simplification, but it's only this long versus this long, this fascicle can shorten much more quickly than this one. So the longer the fascicles, the more sarcomeres in series, the faster that unit can contract. But that interacts with the pennation angle here. If we increase the pennation angle, then we have more physiological cross-sectional area, the force output is higher, and the power output is higher. But we have to balance that out with the fact that the overall length is lower, and so the maximum velocity is lower, and maximum power is lower. Now we're going to come back to this, but this is why we're doing these theoretical underpinnings, this is why periodisation is so important. Because if we do strength training, we increase pennation angle, but it means that the maximum shortening velocity is reduced. So that's why we periodise. We go through phases of high force and trying to increase cross-sectional area, and then as we come closer to the point of competition, we then move towards more velocity training, eccentric training, to try and get back the shortening velocity. This is just some data here from Bodine, 1982, comparing the fibre length of 2 parts of the semitendinosus muscle. And we see here the fibre length, and we see it directly contributes to the maximum shortening velocity. So fibre length really dictates how fast the muscle can shorten. How are we going? Do we have any questions? Okay, keep going. Now, of course, as you all know, the muscle doesn't sit alone. The muscle works in what is termed a musculotendinous unit. Now, when I was a sports science student, I didn't think much about tendons. Now, 30 years down the track, I think a lot about the interaction of the muscle and the tendon, because it's an exquisite design. The muscle and the tendon in all of the systems of the body work in an absolutely brilliant symphony, because they interact. As the muscle starts to shorten, what happens is that the actual tendon lengthens. That allows the muscle to stay in a more favourable length and also velocity of shortening. We don't have the time, I think, we might this afternoon, to go into the biomechanics of the stretch shortening cycle. But that interaction and how we manipulate that with training makes a huge difference on the effectiveness of the musculotendinous unit in terms of sports performance. But for the moment, we just need to get some basics down, and that is the actual properties of the tendon in terms of its cross-sectional area, so how large the tendon is, the length of the tendon, that dictates its stiffness. In other words, that dictates how much the tendon stretches when it has a certain force applied. The larger the cross-sectional area, the higher the stiffness. The less elastic it is, the less compliant it is. The greater the length, then the more compliant the tendon is. Now, many tendons in the body anatomically are longer than others, and it's based around what their function is and how they interact with the muscle that is driving them. Now, of course, we have both passive and active stiffness in the musculotendinous unit. Passive stiffness relates to the tendon, but active stiffness relates to the muscle. And the muscle can actually change its stiffness. In other words, how stretchy it is. It can change that from very short periods of time, simply by how much force of contraction, how much cross-bridge cycling is occurring. So we have a system, a bit like modern cars. You have the modern car where you can actually change the dampening of the springs so you can make them stiffer when you want to go fast, and when you want a more softer ride, you can make them more compliant. The car will float more. The human body's been doing this for 10,000 years. We can alter the stiffness to fit the situation that we require. So here we have, for just one comparison, this study here where they compared female and male runners. And what they see in the patella here, we're looking at the cross-sectional area of different parts of the patella, but what we're seeing here is the actual force applied and the displacement or stretching of the patella tendon. And what this shows us here is, obviously, the higher the force applied, so the more you stretch the tendon, the longer it elongates, it gets longer. And we see that for male runners, they are stiffer than female runners. Differences in stiffness of the tendon determine the physical output of the musculotendinous unit. So it's not just about the muscle and its characteristic, we also in training must consider the properties of the tendon and how we're affecting that. Sorry, my apologies. Just one aspect in terms of musculotendinous stiffness is the rate of tension development here. Now this is reasonably easy to relate to. You imagine an elastic band. When you stretch it, the force increases fairly slowly. A good analogy is towing a car. So your car's broken down, you call up one of your friends, can you give me a tow? Your friend turns up with a chain. Has anyone had their car towed by someone using a chain? No? Oh, it must be an Australian thing. Okay, as soon as they take off, no matter how slowly they take off, it feels like they're pulling the whole front end of your car out. That's why good quality tow ropes will be stretchy. So that as the car drives off, the first thing that happens is the tow rope stretches and gradually transmits the force to your car, and you take off much more pleasant. Same thing happens in the human body. The stiffer the tendon, then the higher the rate of tension development that occurs here. So this is another component which affects human performance. When the muscle contracts, if the tendon is very stiff, that force will be transmitted much more quickly and the force will rise much faster. That's why, in general, particularly in sprint athletes, the stiffer the athlete, and we'll look this afternoon at ways to measure that, the stiffer the athlete, their musculotendinous unit, the higher their performance. In other sports, high stiffness is not an advantage. You need for the athlete to be more compliant. Okay, so they're the morphological aspects of the motor system. Let's have a look now at the actual control. So this is the computer driving the thing. So as you know, the muscles of the body are controlled by electrical messages coming down from the brain. There's several ways in which this system can control the amount of force being produced and the rate at which this force is being produced. The first one is the number of motor units that are recruited. Any given muscle will have a number of motor units. Depending on the muscle, where it's located and its function, it will vary. But if we take an example of, say, the biceps muscle, biceps brachii, for round numbers, let's say that it has 100 motor units. Each motor unit is supplying 1,000 muscle cells or muscle fibres. So we can control the amount of force produced simply by switching on and off the various muscle fibres through the motor units that they control. At a maximal contraction, 100%, all of the motor units will be firing, and that will produce the resulting force output. So it's the main way in which we can control force output. And we see here, this is the actual electromyography measuring the muscle activity in the muscle, the electrical activity, and we see an increasing amount of force up to force maxima. Now, I'm sorry if this is all like going back to your basic physiology, but I just want to get everything. Is that okay, Pedro? We're going okay? I just want to get everyone, so when I move on to other things, we talk about training theory, that we're on the same page. So if you just did neurophysiology last week in class, I apologise, we're going over it again. Now, we have a system in the body whereby during low-level contractions we tend to recruit our slower motor units, our type 1 motor units, and then the higher the force of contraction we start to move to faster and faster motor units. That's a very effective system because it means that our endurance is increased because we only use the fatigue-resistant motor units initially, and then as we require more force, we then have to recruit the larger, more fatigable motor units. It's a beautiful system. The analogy to the car again, you can imagine that when you're just driving slowly, the car just fires 1 or 2 cylinders of your 8-cylinder V8, and then as you need more and more power, it simply switches on more and more cylinders. So that's the way the system works. The important training point is we only activate those very, very fast motor units during maximal or near maximal contractions or during very, very explosive or ballistic actions. That's because the order, what is called the size principle, states that the more force required, we start to use those higher and higher threshold motor units. What that means is that you have to get to a certain level of force before the brain starts to switch on. It says, hey guys, got to use all 8 cylinders. That it starts to actually switch on those very, very large motor units. For most of us sitting around, we're not activating those motor units hardly at all. Yes?
The order of the contraction of the fibers is always the same, or if you do more strength, the order is inverse. First the one, then if I
That is a...
Yes. Power,
yes.
I pass one. Yes, it's the same order always?
That's a really good question. It's not known for sure. There's been a lot of work done. Sorry, the question is, if we actually train in certain ways, can we actually violate the size principle? In other words, can we go straight to those very large, fast fibres? It's been demonstrated in cats. Cats, you know, like a cat. Meow? Okay. In their tricep, okay, because cats, as you can imagine, are extremely fast. Now, it has been demonstrated in an animal model that the cat can actually switch on the fast twitch fibres immediately. It hasn't been demonstrated in humans, okay? Logically, you would think, because the system is so adaptable, you would think that we should be able to do that. It hasn't been demonstrated, but what has been demonstrated is with training, the threshold for the very fast motor units is brought down. So when we have to move very fast, okay, in trained individuals, we can switch on those very fast motor units at a much lower threshold of force output. So that's one of the contributions why certain types of training makes us more explosive. So I hope that answered your question. So we can alter this, but only to a certain extent. So we've talked about that. This size principle does hold true for very fast movements, but the recruitment threshold is typically lower, and it appears to be actually trainable as well. Which is probably one of the reasons why a lot of, quite often people say, well, why don't I just lift heavy weights all the time, okay? But the training adaptations are highly specific, both within the muscle but also within the nervous system. And we have to allow athletes time to actually do very explosive movements so that they can change things such as this size principle and be able to actually activate their very, very fast motor units much more quickly and at a lower threshold. That's why for a power athlete, different thing if you're a power lifter, where you just lift the weight slowly. But for a very explosive athlete, we cannot just do slow, heavy resistance training. It has a critical role, but we must also perform very ballistic, very explosive movement as well for these reasons. Okay. Another way in which the neural system can actually control the amount of force produced by the muscle, but also the rate at which we can actually turn that force on, is through firing frequency. Now, what is happening is if you have a given motor unit, the brain is firing down signals, electrical pulses, which are coming down at maybe 30 or 40 times a second. So it's going sending these electrical signals down. Another way in which force can be increased in a single motor unit is simply by firing it faster. And we can produce quite a large change in force output through this mechanism, around 300 to 1500% increase in force output, going from minimum firing frequency to maximum firing frequency. An important aspect is that this is also trainable. And here we see data from just one study. This is from Van Cutsum's work back in 1998, once again milestone research, showing before and then after training. This is the force output and its relationship to the actual firing frequency. This is the EMG here. So this is, yes?
One fiber or a group of fibers?
In this particular study, they were actually looking at a single motor unit. So using EMG, they were actually able to see the pattern of how a single motor unit fires, and then they were able to track that single motor unit within all the other motor units. Yeah.
One single fiber?
No, many.
One force. Contract the one force, or if they contract more signals, they have more strength. No. One fiber do some kind of force.
Yes.
Measure.
Yes.
Only one.
In this study, it was a single motor unit. So one fibre, nerve fibre, and many hundreds of muscle fibres.
But that fiber only has one strength, one measure of strength. When they contract.
No, we can change that. We can change.
The same power in the one fiber.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. By firing it. Yes. By increasing the frequency of stimulating that fibre. Yes. And produce quite a marked difference in force output for that fibre. Yes?
It's a funny question. I know that when I do more hypertrophy type of training, I tend to sleep a lot better than when I do power training in the evening. It has to do with this?
It does in a roundabout way. That type of power training is highly stimulatory to the brain, so it is more with regards to the system that actually keeps you awake and puts you to sleep. And so yes, if you do very explosive power training in the evening, it will interrupt your sleep. In certain people, some athletes will sleep, no matter where they are. It depends. If you're susceptible to that arousal going on that part of your brain will keep you awake, definitely. Because when you do that type of training, it's a huge outpouring of neural energy. Okay? So that can make you more aroused, but in certain circumstances makes you more sleepy. Okay, we can also change the what is called doublet discharges, where you get 2 consecutive discharges less than 5 milliseconds, 5 1,000ths of a second apart, where we go very rapidly. So the motor unit is going bang, bang, firing extremely quickly, a lot more quickly than I can say it. 5 milliseconds, very short period of time. So by doing that, it can switch the muscle on much faster. And our system does that at the onset of what are termed ballistic contractions. So you can imagine a non-ballistic contraction is where you go, I'm going to squat. A ballistic contraction is where you consciously need to move very rapidly. Okay, so it's ballistic. The way in which the neural system controls that is quite different. I'm pointing this out because this system, as with most of the others we've talked about, is highly trainable. Certain types of training will make it less effective, other types of training will make it more effective. So we can, with training, it's like learning, we can increase our ability in our athlete to fire at higher frequencies. We can also teach our athlete to have greater use of this doublet discharge as well. It not only increases the force, but one of the main changes that occurs is it increases the rate of force development. Now, a very close colleague of both Pedro and mine, Professor K.O. Häkkinen, demonstrated this back in the 80s. What he showed that explosive type training increased the rate of onset of EMG. In other words, the rate at which the electrical stimulation was being switched on. It increased the frequency with which that electrical stimulation was produced, and that resulted in much faster rate of force development. And Professor Häkkinen demonstrated that produced large improvements in explosive and ballistic movement compared to traditional strength training. Again, different types of training produce quite markedly different adaptations in the system. The human system is unbelievably adaptable. It will change to the imposed demands. It is extremely complex how you actually train it, and you alter these to how it adapts and its performance changes. Okay, let's take it up to a higher level now, higher view, and we look at the actual interaction between the various muscle groups, what is termed intermuscular coordination. Again, this is a highly trainable part of the neural system. We're looking at the magnitude and timing of activation of the muscles involved in a movement. If you have a look at a movement which you might think is simple, a vertical jump, okay, it's not simple by any means. People spend their entire careers doing nothing else but trying to understand the counter-movement jump. Because it's an extremely complex interaction between the agonists, so the muscles that are producing the movement, the synergists, or the muscles that actually contract and interact to increase the efficiency of the agonists, and then of course the antagonists, the opposing muscles, which have to be switched off and relaxed at the appropriate time to optimise the performance. This of course produces increases in force and also the timing of the force, because a lot of research has also been done on the power flow through the kinetic chain. You can have an athlete who's very, very strong, but when they perform a movement such as a triple extension, as it's called, so it's the hip, knee and ankle, you must have a highly coordinated and well-timed flow, and all the coaches in the audience know this, of the power output, the energy, down through the kinetic chain. Slight mistimings result in much lower vertical jump and takeoff velocity.